Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this week's lesson, I'd like to tell you about clearance. It's a very important element in chess when you would like to free up one square where you do have a piece of yours for one of your other pieces. We'll start out with some simple tactical examples and move on to more complex and even strategical examples on the same theme. Let's start with our very first example. Here we are. This is an endgame where white has an extra pawn. However, black also has a very far advanced pawn on b2 that's only one square away from promotion. And if black would get the time to, for example, come down with the queen to give a check on d1 and then promote the pawn, white could get in serious trouble. However, in this particular case, white can force checkmate in 2 moves. And for an experienced player, this task shouldn't be very difficult. And in this case, in addition to clearing a certain square for the white queen, white also needs to accomplish to force the opponent's king to a certain unfortunate square. So between those 2 elements, what white needs to do here, and of course first try to figure out the solution by yourself, and when you're ready, the solution is to promoting white's h7 pawn to h8 to a queen. That leaves black with only one choice, king captures queen, and then we're ready to the freed up square, go to h7 with the queen, announcing checkmate. After this very simple and quick example, let's move on to another similarly easy example. And here we go with our second example. And this type of position happens very often in chess, that you have an attack and you have a situation that you would like to capture your own piece. But obviously, based on the rules in chess, you cannot. If the white queen right now could capture the white rook, that would be a checkmate. Of course, as we know, that's illegal. In the meantime, white needs to worry about getting checkmated himself by black playing queen g1 or rook g1. So here the task is, how can white get rid of his own rook? Typically for such situations, just moving the rook away is too slow because it leaves black time to defend against the threat. So it's very important to get rid of the rook with a forceful move. Well, white has 2 forceful moves, either giving up the rook on a7 or on b8. So that's what white needs to figure out. Does it matter whether we give up the rook on one square or the other? In this particular case, giving the rook up on a7 would fail because black would capture the rook not with the knight but with the queen, and at the same time guard the key b7 square, and white is out of luck. On the other hand, if white gives the rook up on b8, then on the other hand, black has no other choice but to capture that rook with the king, and then again we're ready to checkmate. Let's move on to a bit more complex example, but still a very famous one, and you may be familiar with. In this position, there is even material, but black at the moment is threatening to capture the white pawn on g6. And here what we'd like to see is to get the white queen to the h file. The problem is that white has 2 rooks in between, stopping the white queen from getting there at this moment. So what white needs to do is, white needs to clear the first rank so the white queen can get to h1 and then try to checkmate through h7. And this is a very famous pattern where white doing it forcefully by giving one check after another, getting rid of one rook after another. By doing that, clearing the h1 square for the queen. And then finally, the black king will get to g8, and white is ready to checkmate with h7. A beautiful example. Perhaps you've already seen it before, but it's a very ideal representation and illustration of what clearance is. So now we'll move on to some more complex and difficult examples. Here we go. This is a position from a real game played in Moscow in 1964 by two Soviet masters. At the moment, black is a pawn ahead, and there is no obvious way to checkmate like we saw in the previous examples in this lesson. White has an attack, obviously having a bishop on h6 looks quite nice. Black is rather weak on the dark squares around the black king. One of the problems that white faces at the moment is that the rook on f6 is in the queen's way. And while we would like to keep our rook on the board, the white queen really would like to get to f6, but cannot because the rook is there. So this is another of the clearance examples that we would like to get rid of the rook so our queen could get in its place. Of course, the f8 square at the moment is sufficiently guarded by the black rook and queen. So try to think for a moment and figure out how white should proceed to accomplish the ultimate goal, obviously to win the game. And in this case, the solution is, again, a forceful move. Of course, there could be some other times when one side, let's say white, would have the time to simply move the rook, let's say, back somewhere like to f3 and then slowly maybe play queen f2 and queen h4 and then queen f6. However, most of the time, we don't have the time for slow motion. We need to act the most forceful way we can. Of course, with that said, it's also crucial that before you make a major sacrifice of a piece, especially such a valuable piece as a rook, you would want to make sure, double check and calculate accurately to make sure the actual combination works. So again, what we're focusing on in this example and in this whole lesson is clearing space from one piece to another. So here, what happened in the game, white captured the black pawn on g6. Black has to recapture, and now white accomplished something serious. That is that the white queen is ready to come to f6. Unlike in the previous examples, the game is not quite over after that first combination, because here black has various ways, in fact, to protect the key g7 square where white is threatening to checkmate at the moment. In the game, black continued actually moving rook to e7, but could have retreated the queen as well. If the queen was to retreat, white would be taking the pawn and then playing bishop to g5, repositioning the bishop, going to f6. And then at the best case scenario, black will be forced to give up his queen for the bishop to avoid checkmate. Let's go back to the game position where black instead chose to play in this position the rook to e7, not the queen. And now it's a serious challenge how to continue. The best way white can and should continue is to play queen f8, check, forcing the king to h7. And here, the most accurate continuation is to play bishop to g5. And here, black, because is in a pin, the black rook cannot move without losing the queen on a3. Black will not have any decent defense against the white bishop appearing on f6. For example, after queen takes c3, bishop f6, threatening checkmate in the corner, and even though black can defend against that, that would allow a different checkmate on g7. A very nice example of clearance. Let's move on to another quite famous example. Here we go. This pattern has been used in a number of endgame compositions, but this particular one is actually from a real game that former world champion Alexander Alekhine played against Shishko in 1919. It seems that white is in serious trouble when it comes to stopping the black pawn on f2 from promoting. The problem is that white faces that the white king on h1 at the moment cannot go to g2 because they have their own pawn there, which could of course prevent the black pawn from promoting and then the queen staying on the board. So white's goal is, in this particular position, to get rid of that pawn from g2 so that the white king can go to g2 and catch the pawn on f2. And the way to accomplish that is to sacrifice the rook on f5. So for the time being, the rook is behind the pawn, and after king takes, g4 check, king takes, and king g2, and white is home safe while the black king is too far away from catching the white pawn on the a file. And let's move on to another example that also is from a real game that was played in 1947 in the Soviet Union between Ravinsky and Simagin. In this position, it is black's turn, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that white has an extra exchange, although black has one pawn as compensation. Both sides are kind of attacking, although it's quite obvious that the white king is more exposed to open files and diagonals than black's king is. In this example, black needs to clear space to make a discovery possible. It's not hard to recognize that if the black knight was not on e5, then the black bishop would be able to go to e5, give a check to the white king, and therefore create a discovery on the white queen. So again, what we need to focus here on is the task is simple. Black wants to get rid of the knight on e5, even if it's by the cost of losing the knight. And here, black found the winning move by playing knight g4. What's important is that to make sure the important elements to the position remain, namely that by capturing the knight, the white queen is not getting off the g file where the discovery is about to occur. And here, pretty much regardless which white piece captures that black knight, black will follow up with bishop to e5 and then win the white queen. Let's move on. Here we go. Here is another example where we wish that the f6 square would be open for our knight. But we have a rook there. Again, just like in previous examples, if white would simply move the rook away to some random square, for example to c6, to free the square for the knight, it would be too slow because it would give black the time to move the king out of trouble's way and out of the fork. And black would definitely still hang on a while longer. On the other hand, if white plays energetically, namely by capturing the bishop on b6, then after pawn captures back, white is ready to play knight f6. Of course, if the black king now moves to the corner, in that case, black simply loses the rook, while on the other hand, if the king moves to f8, then white has checkmate in 3 moves by check, not capturing the rook, but going for the kill and checkmate. And let's see one more very tactical example. Here we go. In this position, one would need a little bit more creativity and imagination to understand which one is the key square that we want to liberate. It's important to envision the fork with the black queen moving to c5. Looks like a little bit far-fetched. How would that pawn disappear? And even then, white has a knight on d3 guarding that square, so that fork by the queen coming to c5 doesn't seem that obvious. However, if you understand what to look for, and this combination is possible in a good part because white has a piece on an unprotected square. I keep coming back to that important element in chess over and over because I really feel it's very important. So in this case, the solution is capturing the knight and then gaining time by attacking the bishop and clearing the key c5 square. Now, if the bishop moves, whether capturing the pawn or otherwise, black would simply play queen c5 check and fork. Therefore, white in the game continued by playing queen d6, guarding the c5 square, and now, even better than capturing the bishop immediately on d3, which by the way would allow a nasty trap of queen takes c6 and using a backrank problem of black's, black instead should play knight e8, a very important move, and only then capture the bishop. The game continued with queen b4, pawn took, and black won. This is a game between Mikanas and the famous late grandmaster Polugajewski. And let's move on to another example. Here we go. This looks like a very normal and calm position with even material. And strategically speaking, white seems to be actually clearly better because black has an isolated pawn on d4, black has some weaknesses on the king's side, white has a bishop versus a knight, and as we know, with pawns still being present on both sides of the board, typically favors the bishop side. So all in all, it seems strategically speaking that white is doing quite fine. The problem is that it's black's turn, and black does have a tactical opportunity that are all connected to clearance, liberating a certain square for another piece. Again, the experienced eye will notice immediately that by having the white queen and rook at the position that they are at, if the pawn on d4 would not be there, black could make a fork by playing knight d4. And that, of course, calls at least to check the move d3. Of course, it doesn't mean you can immediately make that move, but it definitely calls for checking out that move, see if it works out. First, you're always supposed to look at answers that accepts a sacrifice. So the good news is we can quickly and easily eliminate pawn takes pawn because then knight d4 is quite obvious, gives black material gain. However, you always need to look for the various and natural responses of your opponent. Always be in search for the best response of your opponent, not just of your own moves. So therefore, the key question is, what happens if the queen takes the pawn, which actually happened in the game? Typically, a calculation should continue until you see forceful moves. And in this case, there is a very natural and attractive forceful move by moving the black rook to d8. Now, this immediately puts white in a bind that the white queen needs to move in a way so black will not immediately give backrank checkmate by the rook coming down to d1. As we can notice, the white queen does not have any way to prevent the black rook from coming down to d1. However, it can go, for example, to c3 as white continued in the game, with the idea that after rook comes down to d1, white would simply interpose with the rook to e1. So what should black do? This is one of those typical examples that decent players, compared to real good players, an average player would stop the calculation at this point. Rook d1, rook e1, the combination didn't work. However, master players or grandmaster players would search further. And like in this game, black found it as well. Again, the search should be typically limited to forceful moves. And here comes the next one. f4. Again, black is pressuring white, attacking constantly, not leaving white time to, for example, open a little window by playing h3. White captured, and here comes the next forceful move, making a double attack on the white rook and bishop. And now, white basically is already in trouble. Between the back rank problem and the attack on the rook and bishop, white had no better choice than capturing on h6, still hoping to minimize the damage, considering the fact that if queen takes rook, then white would checkmate on g7, or if the pawn captures the bishop, then the white rook would retreat to e1, and white would still have 3 pawns for the knight and having a decent position. But again, black can do better with another forceful move by playing rook d1 check. White has to block, and again, black doesn't give up, doesn't just capture the bishop, but goes on for the kill by playing knight d4 and threatening with a fork with knight e2. White is in serious trouble right now because black also threatens trading rooks on e1 followed by knight f3, or as a matter of fact knight f3 right away. So black has quite a number of threats against which white has no defense. For example, king f1 wouldn't solve any of the problems because black would immediately use the pin and play queen e2. Going back again to the game position, after knight d4, white continued by attacking the black queen. Unluckily for white, black can still continue with another forceful move by playing knight f3 check. If queen takes, then rook takes rook, and black will stay a rook ahead. And after king f1, a brilliant conclusion to this very impressive combination and sequence of moves by sacrificing the queen, amazingly forcing checkmate on the following move. And now let's see a strategical example on clearance. Here we go. It's a classic game between two of the chess greats, Samuel Reshevsky versus Macking from Brazil. In this position, black has a protected passed pawn on e4, and the white bishop is blockading that. However, as we know, the bishop is not an ideal blockading piece. A knight typically is much better. And here, white uses the element of clearance for strategical purposes. White would like to see a knight on e3, A, to block the pawn on e4, and B, to put pressure a second time on the f5 pawn, and thirdly, to prepare a g4 break for the right moment. Let's see how this game developed. White moved the bishop back to f2. Then black continued with knight f6, which probably is not the most fortunate move. I would prefer bishop to f6 instead, and positioning the black knight on g7 rather. And now white played knight d1. And black is trying to reposition his knight on e7 to guard the pawn on f5. Came knight e3. and black played queen f6. And now bishop went back to g2. White is preparing for the breakthrough with g4. Queen e2, knight e7. And it's action time. White is ready to play f4. A very key move to attack the base of black's pawn chain of f5, e4. If pawn would take pawn, white would capture back with the knight and then capture the pawn on e4 with a very strong position. Black played a kind of waiting move, trying to get out of that diagonal. But white is in no rush. White can now safely play bishop g3 at the moment, protect that pawn on f4 first before forcing the issue of the trade of the pawns between f5 and g4, and after which, as we know, the pawn on e4 will be extremely weak. Black continued trading himself, but now we can see already how weak the pawn on e4 is. Continued with knight g6, attacking the pawn on f4, and of course the knight on h4, and now a key move, knight h2 f5. Black played bishop h8 in the game. When the pawn fell on h6, knight retreated on f5, and white won easily the game later. A very nice example on how to use clearance for strategical purposes. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. This is a very famous endgame composition that has only 4 rooks, no pawns. White seems to be in serious trouble because black is threatening to checkmate on the back rank, and also the white rook is under attack on c5. And yet, white can save the game. After you try solving it, come back and here'll be the solution. Here we go. Rook h5. Amazingly, white can give up the rook and then force the black king into the skewer and win the rook back and save the game. I hope you enjoyed this lesson about clearance and be back next week. Also remember, if you play games on WCL and you feel you have an interesting game that you'd like me to analyze for you and everybody else to listen to, please send it to me to susanpolgar@aol.com. Take care. Bye-bye.